Hello, my name is Darrell Robert Schoon, and I'm going to talk about the economic collapse. But I'm going to talk about it from a different perspective than most people view what is happening to us now. If you are like most people, you didn't expect the crises that we're in today to have happened. You were probably caught off guard. You were working in the last decade, and all of a sudden things started going wrong. At first they started seeming like they were going right. I mean, that house that you had bought for $250,000, you didn't put a new coat of paint on it. You didn't change the appliances. And yet 2 years later, you could sell that house for $350,000 when you had bought it for $250,000 2 years before. You thought this was quite a wonderful thing, that life was working out for you. And if you had sold it at the time, indeed it would have. Unless, of course, you had taken the proceeds from that house and bought another one, a more expensive house. But if you didn't sell your house, what you would have found out was that house that you had bought $250,000 for, that went up to $350,000 or maybe $450,000, you can't sell now for over $170,000. You're $80,000 in the hole. And now you're hoping that things are going to continue to change, but improve, and maybe you'll be able to get out of it. Let me assure you, you're not going to. I saw this coming, this crisis coming, beginning in the 1990s. I had begun studying the causes of the Great Depression during that time for my own peculiar reasons. And by the time the dot-com bubble burst in the year 2000, I pretty much understood that what had happened in the late 1990s with the dot-com bubble that happened in the United States in the 1920s, when we had a run-up in a speculative stock market bubble, which blew up in 1929, and the next 10 years, the United States went into, and took the rest of the world into, what we now know as the Great Depression. Well, I didn't know what the Great Depression was and what made it different than any other economic contraction. And so I began studying, I began reading, and I was very, very lucky. I ran into the right people. I had the right teachers. I had the right information. And by the time the dot-com bubble burst in the year 2000, it pretty much made sense to me. And what I saw happening after that with Alan Greenspan taking the interest rates down from 5.25% down to 1% in 2002, and then unexpectedly, because this was unexpected, seeing another huge bubble emerge, replacing the stock market bubble of the late 1990s. This was the U.S. real estate bubble. All right? And this also was created by the Federal Reserve, low interest rates. And when that blew up in 2006, 2007, it took down the entire world economy. And this is where most of you came in and realized that something was wrong. This is where you realized that your house that you had hoped to sell for $350,000, you couldn't get $250,000, what you had bought it for the year, 3 years before. This is when you begin to realize something might be wrong in a way that hadn't been wrong before. This is when you realize that when you lost your job, you were having trouble getting another job. And you hadn't had trouble getting another job. You had your sort of pick of jobs. I'm going to move to Washington, D.C. and move back with my sister and her husband and some of my friends. And I'm going to find a job there and go to work, and my life will continue. Well, something happened in 2007 and 2008 that had never happened before. But let me assure you, it didn't happen out of the blue. It caught most people unawares, and to them it appeared to happen out of the blue. Now, if you were one of the rare economists, or people who looked at it, most people who were basically, their economic views sort of reflect their political views. The ones on the left, if they knew any economists at all, it was John Maynard Keynes. All right, as the people on the right disparagingly say, yeah, you following the greatest mockery, the greatest fool of all times, John Maynard Keynes and his bankrupt policies. Well, the truth of the matter was, John Maynard Keynes was brilliant. And if you study economics and see what the conclusions he came to and the things he thought about during the time when he was alive, he was an absolutely brilliant economist. Now, because you're brilliant doesn't mean you're right. Another economist, and the ones on the right who disparage John Maynard Keynes, their hero is Dr. Milton Friedman. Dr. Friedman was also brilliant. University of Chicago, made his reputation, loved free markets, talked about freedom. But he was also wrong. He said that he was the one who encouraged Nixon to go off the gold standard in 1971. He said, yeah, you know, if we take the dollar off the gold standard, what will happen is that the market speculators, the free market, is going to give a parity to currencies, and it's going to rebalance the currency so we won't have trade imbalances anymore. Well, Nixon followed Dr. Friedman's advice, and within 2 years, 3 years, the United States had its first negative trade imbalance in 1974, 75. And we've had increasingly large trade balances since that time. And now the United States, rather than being in a world where we have parity with trade balances, we're the largest debtor, and we have the largest trade balance of any nation on the earth. Friedman was wrong, just like John Maynard Keynes was wrong about certain things. So you have this split among economists, the liberals and the conservatives. Well, today and in the next program, I want to talk about economics from a different point of view. From the point of view of two people who saw this coming, all right? And their backgrounds aren't economics, though they, let me assure you, they were both very, very well aware of what's going on economically to the United States and to the world. The first person I'm going to talk about is David Hackett Fischer. He's a professor in the United States. And in 1996, he wrote an extraordinary book. Let me bring it up now. It's called The Great Wave: Price Revolutions and the Rhythm of History. This book was published in 1996 by Oxford University Press, a publishing house befitting of Professor Fischer's background. He's a full professor. He had won a lot of awards, and he's basically a historian. But this book that he wrote was economic history. And in this book, I read it. It was stunning. He predicted what is happening today. All right? This book was published in 1996. But how he predicted it was in a way that I had never seen anybody bring together in the way that he had done. And what Professor Fischer said was this, that what he had discovered wasn't new. All right? He said he and many other economic historians had seen throughout history, you've seen prices. All right? And he said, of all the things that we know in history, we probably understand and have a record of the price of commodities, grains, rents, et cetera, more than anything else. He said, we have receipts from the Babylonian age. We know how much grain cost, all right? We know how much rents were. We know how much blah, 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 blah happened all throughout history. We have receipts from these times, okay? He said, so what he was saying in the book wasn't new, but how he put it together was new. And what he said was this. He said, throughout history, you would have periods of stability, price stability, all right? But every once in a while, intermittently, not cyclically, but intermittently, something would happen to the prices. They would start rising, okay? And they would continue to rise. And as time went on, they would rise higher and higher and higher until these prices reached a crest. And like a wave, they would break and end in the economic collapse of that era. Professor Fischer called these great waves. And that's why you have the title, The Great Wave: Price Revolutions and the Rhythm of History. And what Professor Fischer said was, these great waves of rising prices were not just accompanied by rising prices. It wasn't just price inflation. He said, these price waves, these price revolutions, were accompanied by tremendous societal problems. Some price waves were accompanied by the 100 Years' War. Another price wave was accompanied by the Black Plague. So you have periods of rising prices, periods of tremendous social problems, and each great wave would end in the collapse of the pre-existing era that had been there for 100, 200, 250 years. So what Professor Fischer said was, a great wave of rising prices brought to an end the Middle Ages. Boom! All right? And when that collapsed, out of the collapse of the Middle Ages arose another era that was again stable, but he said this era was at a higher level than the previous era. This era we called the Renaissance. So out of the collapse of the Middle Ages, you had the Renaissance arising, a period of tremendous arts, of culture, of trade. Newness arose out of the collapse of the previous age that the Great Wave brought down. He said, now, you had a period of approximately 200, 250 years or whatever of the Renaissance, the period of the Renaissance. But lo and behold, you go back, and he said, you will find out at a certain point, prices started rising again. Now, Professor Fisher said these great waves last anywhere between 80 and 160 years. But at the end, it doesn't matter if it lasts 80, it doesn't matter if it lasts 160s. What these great waves have in common is they totally end in the economic collapse of the previous era, wiping it clean, and arising out of that, out of the ashes of the old, comes the new. So, this extraordinary book, and I want you to look at it again, because for those of you who are inclined to read about these things, this book isn't very well known in a lot of circles. In some circles, it's very well known. But he writes very, very well. He has all the data. I mean, that's why Oxford University Press published it. This is it, hear it again. I mean, in his book, he has a map of the cities in the Middle Ages that got wiped out by the Black Plague. All right? And then he notes some of the cities got run over twice. I mean, the Black Plague would show up, 5 years, people just, it was horrible. They were picking bodies out in the streets, all right? And then it's over. Except some of these cities, the Black Plague returned. I mean, it's like a double curse, all right? And so this is the kind of research that Professor Fisher has done. Well, he said such great waves had brought to an end the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, and he said, and it's going to bring to an end the current wave, the current age. Now, Professor Fisher calls our current era, he called it the age of Victorian stability. He said because when England arose, they ushered in a period of tremendous social stability, all right? At least if you weren't one of the countries that the English were trying to knock over, they established tremendous stability for the world. They brought the world together, first under their imperialistic umbrella, but the world is very, very different after England entered the stage, the world stage. They basically unified the world. We now have the East and West, we're on the same page, we're using the same currency, basically, you know, the same kind of monetary systems, blah, 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 blah. But like every era, waves of raising prices, what he calls great waves, have brought previous eras to a close. And what Professor Fisher says, the same thing is happening today. Another great wave is already in motion. And what Professor Fisher says, and I want to read here what happens in these great waves. Because he said this happened in Spain, this happened to Italy, this happened to all these other different countries. But let me bring it here. It's an amazing thing to find out. Page 238. Here it is. Okay. 228. Okay. This is what happened. Is that these price revolutions, what happens is, he said, these trends, they're not a cyclical pattern. Price revolutions have no fixed and regular periodicity. Some were as short as 80 years, others as long as 180. They differed in duration, velocity, magnitude, and momentum. These long movements, they all had a common wave structure. The first period was one of silent beginnings and slow advances. Prices rose slowly in a period of prolonged prosperity. So in other words, they interrupt periods of stability and prosperity. He said, however, they enter a second stage. Prices break through the boundaries of the previous equilibrium. Commonly, wars of ambition happened, all right? These set prices up and down. The consequences include political disorder, social disruption, and a growing mood of cultural anxiety. The third stage is when people realize that inflation is now a long-term trend. Governments and individuals expanded the supply of money and increased the velocity of its circulation. In each successive wave, price inflation became more elaborately institutionalized. So what Professor Fisher said, each great wave that interrupted each period of stability became more intense and more elaborate. He says the present great wave, the amplitude of the great wave is even greater than any previous wave. What Professor Fisher says is that the present great wave began in 1896. All right? So, this era that we consider the era that it is the era that we live in. We're familiar with it. All right? It was an era of great technological advance. It was also the era of the greatest materialism that we've ever seen in the history of this planet. All right? But what Professor Fisher said is that this era is going to end in the complete economic collapse that ended every previous era that great waves arose in. But it hasn't happened yet. But what Professor Fisher says, it is about to. And this is what he said. A fourth stage, and this is the stage we're in, began as this new institutionalized inflation took hold. Prices went higher and became highly unstable. This is now happening in Asia. It's not reached here yet, but it is going to. They began to surge and decline in movements of increasing volatility. Severe price shocks were felt in commodity movements. The money supply was alternately expanded and contracted. Financial markets became unstable. Government spending grew faster than revenue, and public debt increased at a rapid rate. In every price revolution, the strongest nation-states suffered severely from financial stresses. Spain in the 16th century, France in the 18th, and the United States in the 20th. Other imbalances were even more dangerous. Wages, which had first kept up with prices, now lagged behind. Returns to labor declined, while returns to land and capital increased. The rich grew richer, the middle class lost ground, and the poor suffered terribly. Inequalities of wealth and income increased. So did hunger, homelessness, crime, violence, drink, drugs, and family disruption. These material events had cultural consequences. This is a time of lost faith in institutions. It was also a period of a desperate search for spiritual values. Young people, uncertain of both the future and the past, gave way to alienation and cultural disaffection. Finally, the Great Wave crested and broke with shattering force in a cultural crisis that included demographic contraction, economic collapse, political revolution, international war, and social violence. Professor Fisher wrote this book in 1996. But what he founded his predictions on wasn't the events of the 1990s and the time he wrote it. If you remember 1996, the dot-com bubble hadn't even gotten its legs underneath it yet. The greatest acceleration in that huge speculative bubble happened in 97, 98, and 99. This was 96, well before the explosion of wealth happened in the United States. Everything looked hunky-dory. And Professor David Hackett Fisher writes a book based upon economic history, specifically in the last 800 years, and predicts, based upon his experience, what is going to happen. Fuel and food are going to lead the movement upwards in prices. Now, I'm onto economics like a dog on the leg of somebody that's trying to eat. And I read this stuff every morning, all right? And let me tell you, what I posted on my website this morning was a graph of food prices. And this from 1900. It was sort of up, stable, 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 blah, 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 blah. And all of a sudden it reaches 2006, and it starts going way up and goes down, way up, and it's starting to go down again. This is exactly what David Hackett Fisher says in the fourth stage of the great waves. the final and culminating stages that ends in the complete economic collapse of the existing era. Now, if you have that disquieting feeling that something is wrong, that the wheels are coming off, and you don't understand why, this book explains why. It predicts it based on 800 years of history. And he said, we're entering it again. The current great wave began in 1896, and you want to talk about what happened, what other disruptions accompanied the current great wave? Well, in the next 50 years, we had 2 world wars. We had never had a world war before. Millions died. And between the world wars, we had a worldwide depression. We had never had a worldwide depression before. This was social catastrophes at a very high level. But after the war, after the depression, it appeared things were getting better. We now went back to, back to a period of stability. But according to these readings, according to this book, all that prosperity was just like the coil of a snake, the coil of a band, building up pressure like an earthquake, like a tectonic plate, not moving, but building and building and building. And on that tectonic plate, we sat there and we had these wonderful lives. And we're going, my God, isn't this a whole lot better? My God, wars are over. We don't have a depression. Boy, I mean, we have everlasting prosperity. Our kids are going to school. Health, all these wonderful things are happening. But let me tell you, we were sitting on a tectonic plate, on an economic and social tectonic plate that was not moving at all. That was like a rubber band, building up pressure beneath it, beneath it, beneath it, ready to explode in another economic and social collapse like every great wave had done for the previous 800 years. Now, John Maynard Keynes, he would say, listen, all you need to do is, during these periods of economic problems, is just pour more money into the system. Pour more money in the system. That'll work. That's what you're supposed to do when you have these great economic contractions, is pour more money in the system. Social spending, helping people. This will bring it back to, to balance. All right? That's what John Maynard Keynes says. The liberals poster boy. All right? Dr. Milton Friedman, the conservatives poster boy. What he said during periods of tremendous economic contraction, like the 1930s, he said it in a different way. He said, expand the money supply. He didn't say how to expand it, but you could have just as well expanded it with social programs. All right? You just need to pour more money in there to offset the contraction. And Ben Bernanke did, and Alan Greenspan did, and what happened? Nada. Nothing happened. It slowed it up, and now in 2012, we're headed down that hill once again. So what we really see here is we have a problem that neither the liberal economists, the old boys such as John Maynard Keynes and their new poster boy, Paul Krugman, and the conservative economists, such as Dr. Milton Friedman and Ben Bernanke, nobody has an answer. Because the problem lies outside the domain of traditional economics. It's a lot bigger. It's a whole lot bigger, and it's happening again today. And in my next program, I'm going to talk about somebody else who saw this from the outside and told us where it was headed. This man's name is Buckminster Fuller. And he also had his finger on the pulse of economics. But this man's vision was extraordinary as it was profound. And that's why I want to assure you, it looks like we're headed in the drink, but let me assure you, when we come out of it, it's going to be a new world. Because my money is on Bucky Fuller, and I'm betting he's right.